This is a conversation that I've been looking forward to hosting. A little bit of planning has gone into this. Everyone knows Dr. Sven Steinmo, who's got a really exciting piece, Trump is Not the Problem, which is causing a lot of debate in his friend circles. We also brought on Dr. Mark Blyth, who's a political economist and professor at Brown University. Dr. Blyth, I'm just quoting from Brown's website, but you're a political economist whose research focuses upon how uncertainty and randomness impacts complex systems, particularly economic systems, and why people continue to believe stupid economic ideas despite buckets of evidence to the contrary.
Correct.
You've obviously authored several books, which I think we'll get into some ideas from your books, but some of those titles are Great Transformations, Economic Ideas and Institutional Change in the 20th Century, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, and I'm sure there are others.
Angrynomics, very appropriate for this conversation, Angrynomics.
And then, I think the reason this conversation will be interesting is there's some overlap between your two perspectives on institutions and tax policy, and then maybe some very different perspectives on just politics and economics in general. There's three topics that we're going to get into. The first one, I took it from one of your research papers, Dr. Blyth, but the austerity delusion. We'll talk about dictators and democracies because that is a hot topic right now. And then we'll do some commentary towards the end on politics today and the decline of American influence. Just to start the discussion. And we'll start with Blyth and then we'll move to Steinmo. But let's talk about the austerity delusion. As I was taught in my early politics classes, this is a conservative legacy that we might ascribe to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So the first question, Dr. Blyth, is why did austerity fail?
To understand why it fails, you have to understand what it is, right? So austerity is a belief that if you cut the government's budget, this will inspire confidence in the investor class. And because of that, they will be, how can I put it, their animal spirits will be boosted by this credible commitment of the government to cut all that wasteful spending. That will make them more willing to invest in your economy. And then your economy will have a boom. So the terrible slump that you're in will be self-corrected simply by telling people that they will pay less taxes 20 years from now because you credibly commit to cut budgets just now, and that will make the investor class giddy with delight, and they will invest so much that you'll avoid the recession in the first place. When I describe it that way, it sounds ridiculous because it is utterly ridiculous, but there was a great deal of high-tech, very mathematical research out there to back all this up. They tried it in the Eurozone in 2010 to 2014, and it was a disaster. They lost a decade of growth. There was mass unemployment in the South. It gave us populism, and we hope that COVID had kind of confined us to the dustbin of history. Unfortunately, it's now coming back. It's back in fashion. The Germans are back at it again with this thing called the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake, and that type of austerian thinking that we must cut spending in order to save ourselves from the future profligate space that we find ourselves in is back. That's why I call it a dangerous idea. It's immune to empirical refutation.
Interesting. Okay. And Dr. Steinmo, potentially in response to that, the question I would have for you is who said austerity failed? It worked well for some.
Yeah, I think that was my quote. Well, it did work well for some. It worked well for, as Mark calls it, the investor class, or more generally, very wealthy people. Did great. We may not disagree as you wish us to. Stepping back a moment, there's a long-standing debate between those who believe that that government is something can help people generally, and those who believe that government takes money from the wealthy investor class, etc., and that the way to spark growth is essentially trickle-down economics. That's the old word for it. And austerity is another version of trickle-down economics, except for it's very explicit that you actually give lots of money to the very wealthy, and then everyone is going to get better off. And as Mark has suggested, there's zero empirical evidence for this, The evidence is very clear. Go to a city in America today. You see it. People in the street who can't even afford housing. That's the consequence of trickle-down economics.
Okay, and Dr. Steinmo, so like, how do you think austerity measures or policies have contributed to the effects of polarization in Western democracies?
Well, again, that's fairly obvious that people who, let's say in the post-war years, which were really, really good years for working and middle class, not just Americans, but Europeans, etc., in democracies, they were doing very relatively well. Incomes were increasing, etc. When the idea that Ronald Reagan brought forward in American politics and Thatcher in British politics and elsewhere, spawned by this insane neoliberalism of Milton Friedman, that everybody's going to get better off if you get the rich richer. Well, if you think about the economy as a pie, right? The bigger the pie that the very wealthy people take, the smaller the pie that's left for everyone else, unless the pie really expands, which of course it didn't. So the people who are having a smaller piece of the pie are pissed, and that leads to populism.
We're not going to disagree again. I mean, you know, people get bent out of shape on this one and say, well, it's not as simple as that. There's status loss, and it's also about this and that and all that. And yes, of course, it's multifaceted, right? I mean, one of the counterpoints to this sort of economic roots of populism argument is to say, well, actually, it's really about status loss among sort of white Americans. It's really about racism, etc. I don't disagree with that. I would simply point out that sort of, you know, economic loss isn't something that, like, everyone responds to in the same way. Right, and all sort of, you know, it's not as if, like, you know, price changes in the economy telegraph into everyone's head in exactly the same way and we all have the same response. If you're in a highly segregated, highly unequal, and very racially segregated society like the United States, it's entirely possible that your feeling of loss will be manifested in resentment towards other groups. You see this in Europe with immigration. You know, are migrants a problem? Well, it's a really nice distraction for the people that made off with the big slice of cake, as Sven puts it, because ultimately, what do immigrants do? Well, if you don't have enough kids, then you can't pay for the pensions you promise yourself in the future. And if you're not going to have immigrants, then you're going to have to pay more taxes. And if you don't want to pay more taxes and you don't like immigrants, you're kind of stuffed. But nonetheless, populist parties aren't really into solutions. They're just into stoking anger so they can get elected. And that's the type of response that you get. So this kind of trickle down leading to immiseration, relatively speaking, labour share of income declines, capital's income increases. That's sort of mediated through a whole host of institutions and different responses, but it is definitely driving it.
Do you think that this question is for both of you, and again, can be in agreement or just discourse, but why do you think, like, conservatives are the party that has kind of co-opted these ideas of austerity historically? Like, why has that, you know, been ascribed to conservative political?
That's actually a really good question, because it's changed, right? There's a change within this, right? So historically, yeah, I mean, basically the investor class conservatives, don't waste my money, I care about inflation because inflation erodes the real value of my wealth. Therefore, you don't spend money and get into trouble, right? That's the standard old story. But what's super fascinating now is that the working classes, the ones that would benefit, if you want to put it that way, more from increased government spending, etc., have turned towards right-wing parties. Now, why is that? Because they're going to stuff them, right? I mean, you saw this last time with Trump, right? Essentially, you get massive tax cuts for the very, very top. Caveat. But let's remember the run-up in wages for the bottom 40% began under Trump. Let's remember that Trump was the one who shouted down the Federal Reserve on Twitter into not raising interest rates to run the economy hot. So real wages actually do increase under right-wing governments. Now, why is this important? Because the Democrats, particularly under Obama, but also under Clinton, were the ones that outsourced jobs. They were the ones that shut down the Midwest. They were the ones that thought trade agreements and international liberalism and globalism were the best thing ever. And when that proves to be, as it has been for the Midwest in particular, but other parts of the country, absolutely devastating in terms of jobs, income, employment, well-being, deaths of despair, the whole lot, they are the party that finds it hardest to turn around, disavow their entire legacy, and embrace, if you will, a kind of nationalist, populist protectionism. Whereas for the Republicans, it's much easier to do that, even though they're just in many ways just as complicit.
I'd add to that I mean, there was a period in which the conservatives, that is to say, or business interests or whatever, really did understand, or many of them really did understand, that rising wages, rising incomes was good for capitalism, right? That more consumers, more stuff to sell, more profits to make. And so it's not simply that, oh, they've always been against the state. Of course, nobody including working class white people, or for that matter, African Americans, nobody likes to pay taxes, except for some crazy little leftists, maybe like me. But the problem then is that we've got the Republican. I think I very much agree with what Mark was saying, that, and I actually put this onto Bill Clinton. He was running up for election. He was going to lose, so he turned into a Republican, an old-fashioned hate the government, end welfare as we know it, export jobs left and right. And they had this very, very naive idea, what he called the knowledge economy, that, oh, everybody's going to become software engineers and everybody's going to get wealthier if we just get rid of these shitty-ass jobs. And there is something correct in the Trump populist critique of the Democratic Party, which is they did get taken over by elites who don't give a shit about working class people.
It still goes over my head the way that the political parties have kind of melded themselves over the years and kind of evolved. Bill Clinton took credit for, who was the conservative policymaker, Speaker of the House at the time?
Gingrich?
Gingrich.
Yeah, he took credit for Newt Gingrich's ability to balance the budget. I don't even know if the Democrats and Republicans would be able to work together like that today. It seems like they're struggling to manage the lower chamber, let alone speak across party lines. But, I think this kind of gives a solid foundation for how to think about austerity and some of the effects of austerity and the kind of transformation of American politics to this era that is now being led by Donald Trump. But if we transition to dictators and democracy and the spread of illiberalism around the world, what do you think is the kind of root of the contagion of democratic leaders moving from populism to maybe a more dictatorial approach to governance in Western democracies?
So which ones do you have in mind? If it's not Trump,
in the media is going to cite Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. They're going to try to cite Imran Khan in Pakistan.
Right, but these are not. You did say sort of kind of like Western democratic society.
When you use the term democracy, the fact that there are in that sense, China and Russia are democracies because there is voting going on. It doesn't make you a democracy.
Right. Exactly. So let's pull this down a little bit, right? What's Bolsonaro about? Bolsonaro is basically an old story in Latin America whereby the people around labor and people who want to modernize the state and diversify the economy, that was the Lula coalition, once again tried to do so. And when there was a giant commodity upswing in the world economy, the way that Brazil makes its money, like the rest of Latin America, is exporting commodities. When that commodity bubble burst, they were suddenly losing money. They weren't willing to pay for the Bolsonaro they weren't willing to pay for the Lula experiment at the same time. They found Bolsonaro, they threw him in. He basically is agribusiness, burned down the Amazon, doubled down on the commodities. What you see in Milei in Argentina is a very interesting one. You got a situation whereby the Peronists, another sort of like laborist movement at its core, can't really put losses onto its constituents. It's a highly unequal society. Those people who are able to protect themselves with dollar accounts don't feel the effects of inflation. At least 40% of the population is in dire poverty, for whom having hundreds of percents of inflation is actually really, really painful. And they no longer believe the Peronists were actually willing or able to do anything. They thought they were out to protect their own, shall we say, elites. So across the world, there's a feeling that there's a whole bunch of elites out there that are out for themselves, right? I'll give you another example of this. Somebody's phone's going off. Yeah. Who's that? That's outrageous.
That's Steinmo.
Yeah, and I turned it off.
Come on, Steinmo. Class is in session.
Shut your phone off, for goodness sake.
Class is in session. Come on.
So I'll give you another example. Remember the yellow jackets in France?
Yeah.
Right? So that's another populist thing, right? Well, if you actually look into what they were concerned with, it's pretty straightforward. The French government tried to put a carbon tax on the economy. And French business said, no, not us. So in order to basically get their carbon tax, they put it on ordinary consumers, and they buried it in a budget, and it's 5 years before it became active. And then suddenly the people who, there's no train links to the small towns outside Paris unless you're on one of the metro lines. All the people that commute into work, suddenly their diesel prices were going through the roof. At the same time, maritime diesel was exempt, industry was exempt, and the money that were taken from the carbon tax was actually going into a fund to give to the biggest French companies to help them cheapen their labor costs to be more internationally competitive. So when the Yellow Jackets said it's the elites, they're out to screw us to benefit themselves, that's not populist rhetoric. That's actually a very accurate rendition of what happens. Right? So one of the common threads here in the academic study of populism is, oh, it's this thin ideology, and it's about this big man who comes along and he pulls the wool over the eyes of people. No, sometimes it's actually people harnessing the fact that the elites literally have run off with everything and are screwing everyone else. And when that happens, you get a reaction which can be very ugly, but is actually a genuine reaction.
I did a study a couple of years ago. I think we had 3,500 respondents to a set of questions about, we gave them essentially a simplified U.S. budget with both taxes and spending on both sides, and then asked them, they spent about 15 minutes trying to adjust the budget from, they knew what it was currently and what they would prefer to see. And one of the things that was really, really interesting, we divided them up. If you look at them as Trump voters and Clinton voters, if you look specifically at those groups, there really wasn't that much difference in what they wanted. And one thing there was a lot of agreement on was that they felt that taxes on the wealthy were too high and there was too much inequality in America. These are Trump voters and Clinton voters.
That's fascinating. Okay, and so what do you think is leading to the hard right politics in Israel?
That's a whole kettle of fish on its own. I mean, one of my favorite lines about Israel is it's a travel agency that failed to become a state. So I don't think that we could really put that in the same sort of camp. I mean, it's the last settler colonial society in the world. It was founded in 1948, at the same time as the UN, at exactly the moment when the UN said, you can't do that anymore. There was an incomplete civil war. That has never been resolved. That's completely different from all this sort of stuff. Now, the way that you want to tie populism into it, you have someone in the form of Netanyahu who has weaponized this struggle and played a particular politics that has led to increased settlements, etc., and increased conflict, and stoked that and tried to cordon off, if you will, the Palestinians and the Palestinian problem per se. And now that this has resulted both in the tragedy of 10/7 and then also what's happened in Gaza, he has an interest very much like Putin in simply continuing this for as long as he can, because otherwise he's out on his neck.
And may go to jail.
And may go to jail.
Let me add one thing.
It's another thing about populists. They always seem to be at risk of going to jail as well, actually, or at least the successful ones. Because remember, Sven and I spoke about this years ago. The original populist in this regard was Berlusconi.
Yeah, right. I once had a website called Trumpisconi.
Trumpisconi, right, exactly. Because, there's this Italian dude, he comes in from the media world, everyone's corrupt, only I can fix it,
That's right.
Gets in, puts all these cronies into power, turns out he's got 15 charges that can send him to jail. Turns out, guess what? If you're a president, you're immune from prosecution. Where are we hearing this now?
Yeah.
Very strange, isn't it?
Well, actually, so a little story about Berlusconi that I think is relevant. I lived in Italy for 10 years, and I was having my hair cut by this older guy, and we started talking a little bit about politics, and he was a Berlusconi supporter. And I was trying to, gently figure out why. And he said the most pithy thing. He said, they're all crooks. Berlusconi is the best of the crooks. That's why he supported him.
That's a good one.
But let me say a little bit, if I may, about Netanyahu. As an institutionalist, this is something I think very few people are picking up on. But Israel has a very, very fragmented electoral system. I think you need 0.5% of the vote to get a member into the Knesset, right? What that has meant over time is that crazy right-wing religious parties have been extremely important in the electoral success of any coalition. And what they've then done is basically taken that political power and translated it into economic power. So as you well know, if you're a very fundamentalist Jew. You don't have to serve in the military. You get all kinds of tax advantage. Basically, you are on the welfare tit, and have lots and lots and lots and lots of children, right? And so their share of the population and their share of a political power has grown enormously, and Netanyahu has played on that very, very well.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is like where a lot of my mental models are starting to just shatter into pieces, is that United States foreign policy sees Israel as a democracy that is supposed to help with some kind of maintenance or spread of democracy in the Middle East, and we've seen that fall flat in dramatic fashion. Also, I think, like, I'm wondering if some of these theories that say that U.S. foreign policy should seek to align itself with these ideas of democracies is just an old hat, out of date way of thinking. Another leader that, you know, gets cited by liberals when they're critiquing the hard right is Erdogan. But do you have thoughts on, like, what's happening in Turkey, or what Erdogan is doing to kind of reverse the democratic institutions that exist there, or what little of them exist?
I mean, that's a bit off my wheelhouse, but I mean, essentially what you're doing is you're playing the rural constituencies against the urban constituencies, and that's a very old playbook. It's actually not, if you look at the US electoral map, it's not that different from the US one.
Exactly.
So there's that. There's also, you know, it's the Peace and Justice Party. It has religious overtones, but hasn't completely stepped out of a secular space. It pulls a certain demographic, which tends to be poorer and different from the urban constituencies. And that's sort of enough to roll it in. You could say that the until recently, politics in Poland were very much characterized by a similar set of processes. So, you know, that's part of it in that regard, is like you're able to put the rural against the urban playbook, and that seems to work quite well electorally.
Right now,
and then you tweak your electoral institutions to make that work, and you get it locked in. You know, it's no different from Republican gerrymandering. I mean, it's very similar.
Right. Okay. Right now, the farmers are surrounding Paris with trucks because they've been subsidized more than anybody in the world, except for maybe American farmers. They don't want that cut, and so what you might call austerity, and I don't think it's actually come under those terms, but they're pissed as hell because they've been benefiting from a system that they had political advantage because of it wasn't gerrymandering in the American sense, but the overrepresentation of rural districts and rural areas has given them more and more subsidy. And so they're 2.5% of the population, but they are angry as hell because now food's coming in from abroad, they want to support it, etc. So nobody likes to lose benefits. That's a fact. One of the things I've noticed in Sweden, which I have studied a bit, is that the Communist Party, voters for the Communist Party, which tend to be classic, you know, blue-collar workers, are now voting for a neo-fascist party.
If you look at the German one, right, the support of the AfD, which is a right-wing party that began as an anti-Euro party set up by a bunch of professors, right? Who did this end up? Where is the base of support? It's in Eastern Germany. It's massively Eastern Germany. Why? Because that's the bit that basically didn't make the transition well. Amongst old people who didn't make the transition well, that's really the base of support. Sarah Wagenknecht, who's basically the left-wing equivalent of this, who's very pro-Russian, etc., is on the left, right? It's a slightly more diversified base, but again, essentially sort of those eastern districts are where a lot of that discontent comes from. They're older, they're poorer, if you want to put it in class terms, they're more working class. They're not able to participate in Bill Clinton's knowledge economy. And if you're not, then you get, you know, basically the bottom end of the returns bucket.
But so in simple terms, that, you know, this is kind of a justification for like the anti-globalist perspective, like just, you know, broad sweeping.
It's not a justification for it. To justify means it implies that it's somehow illegitimate, right? If, as Sven says, people are like taking losses, right? I mean, you know, look at David Order. He's an economist at Harvard. 10 years ago, he did a a study called the China Shock, and it looked at zip code level losses because of Chinese imports. They're in the $5,000, $6,000 per head in some areas, right? You're talking the absolute economic devastation of what used to be some of the richest parts of the country. Think about Detroit. Detroit was one of the most populous cities in the Union. It was one of the most profitable places to make things. And then it basically became almost a third of its size in its heyday. So, you know, when you make large parts of the country disposable, don't expect people to be happy about it. And, you know, if Trump walks into a factory in Wisconsin and goes, I know why you're all pissed, it's China. And they know that the parts manufacturer that was owned by the American company that went to China, that used to be there, did that. It's not a delusion. This is what happened.
That's right.
And, you know, the liberal elite refuse to admit they're culpable. They just totally refuse.
Yeah. And I thought, you know, just on a basic level that as part of having an advanced economy, that meant you maintained an industrial base. And
not necessarily.
No?
The whole world is actually deindustrialized. No, I mean, like, seriously, right? I mean, what do you consume on an average week? How many cars do you buy? How many fridges do you buy? Right? You don't, right?
Yeah.
What you buy are services. What you buy, particularly in a digital economy, are kind of zero marginal cost goods that are produced by digital behemoths that make tons of money, right? So, I mean, is that industry? Well, I don't know. It makes a ton of money in value added. You know, 80% of the United States economy is essentially services. 11% is manufacturing. So it's 11% of a, what is it, 34 trillion. I can't remember the size of the. Can't remember US GDP just now. Yeah. But anyway, 11% of that's probably about 3 trillion. That's bigger than Germany. So even having a small part of this in manufacturing still actually kind of huge in terms of the global economy. So that one, I'm not so sure that one's actually that important.
Well, and it is also the case that, a very personal example, my brother-in-law was an airplane mechanic. Now he's retired. But as an airplane mechanic, he was making significantly more money than I was making as a professor. Now, when they hire airplane mechanics, they're making significantly less than an assistant professor. So in other words, if his kids went into being an airplane mechanic for, you know, a major airline, they would be making, and I don't know the exact numbers, but in real terms, a lot less money. You know, they're falling off. The children and grandchildren of a class of people in America that was doing very well are not doing very well. And not only the kids, but their grandparents are pissed as hell about it. But if you go to Brown University or Harvard or Yale or whatever, and people talk about the knowledge economy, that makes a lot of sense. But if you live in an area where the high schools are underfunded or doing 4 days a week because they can't afford to pay teachers, the quality of education is lower, the odds that you're able to get into one of the elite schools and be part of this knowledge economy are pretty low.
But so is this the point where people who are not experiencing wage growth need to... I think this is impossible, actually. So maybe this isn't even a question. I'm just going to put a statement out. But I noticed that it's near impossible to do reskilling, even if we're just looking at like a corporation, right? Either bundle the skills into the software applications or you outsource to a consultancy. So if we're looking at the economy and we're saying like this part of the manufacturing sector, these wages are being eroded, these jobs occur less frequently. It seems that that's almost an impossible problem for workers that maybe start to subscribe to these populist movements because, you know, in their minds, what solution do they have? They're not going to become a software engineer or a, you know, political scientist necessarily. It's like, you know, it's like...
Do you remember in the 2016 campaign when Hillary Clinton was then confronted in West Virginia about what you're going to do with all these coal miners once you shut down the coal mines? She said, we're going to turn them into coders. Yeah. That's completely ridiculous, right? Considering, of course, if AI is all it's cracked up to be, the first job that's going to go is coders. So,
there's
you know,
a bit
let's
of
just put
irony
that to
there,
one
that's
side.
for sure.
Yeah, exactly. No, so, you know, to take to take this seriously, no, I don't think it's a counsel of despair. It's a question of, like, enormous wealth will be generated. An enormous surplus is there. It's just not going to be paid through wages in the way it was before. Now, whether you're somebody who thinks it's a universal basic income, I have my reservations for reasons we can talk about. Whether it's basically you tax the robots and make sure that the returns of robots go back to the citizens, right? Whether it's through you basically take a share in these companies and have a kind of citizens' wealth fund and then you basically distribute that. There's loads of ways to do this. If you think about decarbonization and skills, right, what is the one thing America's short of? Every so-called advanced economy is short of? Housing. And our housing is 1/3 of our carbon emissions. Now, you want to do green housing, what do you need? Electricians, HVAC engineers, builders, people who know how to work with synthetic materials. That is pretty high-skill stuff. So, yeah, we don't need any coders because the machine can code itself, but we absolutely need 1/3 of the buildings replaced. So, the notion that there's nothing to be done. I mean, similarly, when Sven and his generation are all basically banged up in a home getting spoon-fed by a teenager, wouldn't it be nice if that person actually had some skills? Wouldn't it be nice if they were paid a decent living wage so they didn't abuse Sven? I would be hugely in favor of that. So there's a lot that needs to be done and a lot that can be done. Yeah, you would be too, exactly.
Yeah, and I would agree. And back to it might be one might misinterpret this to be something like the good old days, and I really don't mean it that way. But in the post-war expansion, one of the things they did was, quite importantly, a thing called the GI Bill. Basically, they said, you come back, the people who went off to fight World War II came back and they said, we're going to give you a free college education, right? And the cost of college, when I went to college at UC, University of California, was $638 a year, right? So one of the other things is that by this austerity program means that public subsidies to public education at the university, college, junior college, and high school, et cetera, level has declined, and therefore the bridge that education used to provide, is eroded. If you're going to have a knowledge economy, you need to have people who have the education to do it. You can't say, oh, okay, well, and again, I really do think that Trump critique, there's some real truth in the Trump critique. The people who are taking advantage of the knowledge economy are basically people who are upper middle class and upper class kids, right? Who can afford those educations. And, you don't have to be a Trump voter or supporter to see that there's truth in that critique.
There's a paper from John Friedman and Raj Cherry just a few months, maybe a couple of months ago, that basically says when you control for every factor you can imagine, you're still twice as likely to get into an elite college on one factor and one factor alone. Are you very wealthy? Now, that's not sort of like Marxist critique coming from left field, right? That's a guy at Brown and a guy at Harvard. And they crunch the numbers, and that's kind of the truth. So to what extent is the critique that this is a self-replicating elite just a critique?
And even when we talk about the knowledge economy, like you were saying, a number of those jobs are also being eroded by automation, and we're in this weird place right now where there's much higher unemployment in the technology sector than the broader unemployment number.
I know, it's funny that, isn't it? Yeah, it's
significant.
Weird.
And then the tech companies are taking the guidance that's coming from the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, and they're using it as a justification to be very conservative and to continue to trim heads. Large software company, SAP, just announced that it is launching a new artificial intelligence initiative and looking at reorganizing and potentially cutting the heads of 8,000 additional employees. Do you think, just to stick here for a second, do you think Dr. Blyth, if the Fed chairman was to start to reduce interest rates, that the tech sector could recover?
Look, I hate to break it to everyone, but interest rates aren't even high.
That's right.
They're really not. They're only high in reflection to a weird period where they were zero. Interest rates are actually today where they were in 2006. Nobody remembers that. They were higher in 2001 when we had a boom time before we had a bust, right? So the whole interest rate thing is just weird. Most of the inflationary period, they've been negative in real terms. That is, the inflation rate's been higher than the interest rate. So, and they didn't even bring down inflation. This is a much longer conversation, but no, that's all rubbish, right? The really interesting thing I'd go with is this. Here's a simple way to think about it that a guy called Mark Herman Schwartz has written about, and I think it's very compelling. Back in the good old days, we had vertically integrated firms that were sector specific, that basically had similar industrial structures to everybody else in a different sector. So as Tom Oatley put it, 1 in 5 jobs in 1971 were in autos. 1 in 3 were in all the other feeder industries. We're all part of one big vertically integrated coalition. And what that meant was the workers in those firms had hold-up power. If you were doing the parts supplies for GM and you went on strike, GM was screwed too. So if you wanted a pay rise, yeah, you had power to get it. Then what happened was, apart from all the neoliberal stuff, right, is basically we were able to change the structure of the firm. And what happened was those vertically integrated things basically stripped off into firms that did nothing but intellectual property, high-end design, etc. Think of all your big 7 tech firms, right? They have moats and castles. They protect themselves through IP. They have ecosystems that are rival. If you're on Apple, you're never going to use PC, all this sort of stuff. And then they basically charge you subscriptions and make rents off it. They hardly employ anyone in terms of the overall labor market, but they make a tremendous amount of money for shareholders and the insiders in those firms. Then, stick with Apple as an example. You've got the people that actually make their hardware. Think Gorilla Glass and Corning Glass. They still employ a lot of people, relatively speaking. They pay pretty good wages. But what's their constraint on investment? Their constraint is what Apple's budget is. And Apple sources globally and sells globally and assembles globally. They're not tied into the American labor market to any real extent. Now, move from Corning Glass to the rest of the economy, the 80% of firms that basically make barely any profit. They kind of run on a franchise model, whereby let's say you go hotels, right? You go to Hilton, you borrow the brand for a fee. You put together some investors, you buy or you rent some buildings. You then bring in someone who turns them into hotel rooms. Then you hire somebody to do the staffing. Then you hire 10 different companies to do the cleaning, the cooking, etc. And every single one of them is on the lowest bidder, and the profit model is to take it out of labor. So you end up with an industrial structure where nobody has striking power, apart from 1 or 2 tiny sectors like autos still, and that's still dubious, where basically all the rents flow straight to the top and the profit model for the bottom is essentially squeeze labor. And that's the world that we built. So, if you're actually, somebody who owns one of these top firms, or you bought Apple shares back in the day, well, good for you. But has it been good for everybody else? Nah, not really.
Moreover, if I may add, the other thing that's gone on is that those extraordinary amount of wealth that's been generated for the wealthy is taxed at a fundamentally, even if they paid the taxes that were on the books,
right,
they would be paying a lot less taxes than they would have 20, 30, 40 years ago. But then you add, especially in the American case, the incredible number of specific loopholes so that people like Musk and, the list is obvious, essentially pay no taxes at all because they don't have any income.
Mm-hmm. Can I tell you one of the favorite scams for that? Loan income isn't actually taxed. So what you do is you take your stock. Why is it that like Elon wants to be paid in stock? You take your stock and pledge it as an asset against a loan. You reckon that those stocks are going to increase in value, so the net present value of your loan is higher than what you'll pay back, right? So as the stock goes up, the collateral value goes up, so the value of the loan you're paying back in real terms actually goes down. You then have loan income to spend as income, but it's not actually income, so you don't pay any taxes on it. Right. This is brilliant. Just don't pay any taxes.
Yeah. And there's so many loopholes. I feel like. What was
but
the
they're not loopholes. Loopholes is the wrong way to think about it.
Right.
Loopholes implies that basically a team of accountants have been drilling holes in things, right? There's a little bit of that. We fundamentally tax income from capital and income from labor in totally different ways. And it's just become, over time, more and more apparent that is the case. And capital pays no taxes, but they have most of the money.
It used to be the case that capital income was taxed at a higher rate than earned income. Now, earned income is taxed at a higher rate, and capital income is essentially not taxed at all. So If you are somebody that has significant resources, what do you want? You want all of your income to be in the term of debt income or capital gains income, and all of those. By the way, going back to the point about how the wealthy are repeating themselves, that wealth, when it's passed on to another generation, is not taxed at all.
Exactly. And then you got pass-through corporations and other sorts of things whereby you can put your money into a vehicle that basically allows you to indefinitely postpone the tax. There's trusts at the family level, etc. Family offices for super rich families because you can't trust the kids with their own money. Yeah, it's all there.
It seems like the elite, the class that controls this capital, has no interest in giving their money back to society per se, right?
Well, why would you when you're no longer part of society?
Yeah, that's right. You live in it. The old-fashioned version was a gated community. It's way past that now.
Yeah, years ago during the financial crisis, I did an interview, and so one time I said something that became both a kind of like a Twitter, I pre-meme, so I'm not sure what it was, but actually a T-shirt slogan, and it was "The Hamptons is not a defensible position." You might think it is, but it's really not. So there was a really interesting one a couple of years ago when sort of wealth protesters were basically going around the Hamptons and doing demos and stuff like that. And the local cops were like, what the hell are we doing? And they were picketing the house of one of the biggest sort of like Wall Street hedge fund guys. And his response was kind of emblematic and kind of brilliant. He had a 6-foot wall. He made it a 12-foot wall.
Jeez. I'm sure that worked.
Well, it did from the point of view you didn't have to see them. That's it. And then when he leaves, he goes to a restaurant where none of those people will be there, etc., etc. Because the guy who used to run, I think it was Bear Stearns, I can't remember, he flew in from Long Island in a helicopter, landed on the top floor, took a separate elevator, worked only with the people in C-suite, never saw anybody else, and then left again.
You know, this is why I get frustrated with this whole liberal democracy to authoritarianism dichotomy that's not real.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But basically, we're an oligarchy with airbags.
Yeah. So maybe maybe to that point, if you're isolated from the public life and you're sitting on a pool of assets that no one human will ever be able to consume, or even a small group of humans will be able to consume, it's no wonder the common citizens are being exploited by political entrepreneurs that use populist style rhetoric.
Yeah, but let's remember the guy that Sven was talking about. He was well down the food chain, even though he was doing comparatively well, and he shared that ideology. The one who dies with the most toys wins. Right? Not everybody has redistributive preferences. 1/3 of any population could be characterized by social surveys as conservative or deeply conservative. Being conservative is not an error. This is something that totally puzzles me about the American reaction on the sort of the liberal side to conservatism. It's as if conservatives have gotten something wrong. They haven't gotten something wrong. They just like society to be a different way. You might not like that different way, but it's completely coherent. They also don't, they believe that the majority of people are pretty lazy. As somebody who grew up working class and pretty poor, I can see a lot of evidence for that lying around myself. I tend to think of the better angels of ourselves. I tend to think of structural causes. But I'd be an idiot if I turn around and says, no, that's completely wrong. Everyone tries really hard all the time, and they're getting done by the man. Mm-hmm. No.
Okay.
And
that's fair.
Add to policy problems have never been easy to solve. So,
right.
When Ronald Reagan came out and did the welfare queen speeches, basically characterizing this woman driving from welfare office to welfare office in a Cadillac collecting paychecks, right? Now, of course, that wasn't a real person, but there absolutely was a fair amount of welfare fraud. And moreover, one of the things that happened in our welfare system is that essentially it incentivized families to break up. Because if the husband lived with the family, they didn't get the welfare check. So you ended up with generations of people raised without the father. And that then, of course, created social problems. So changing welfare as we knew it was probably a good idea. Dumping the system and turning it into a tax credit, probably not.
Okay, so the political entrepreneurs can tap into these grievances, right? They're persistent and they have more distributed ways of communicating to these bases of people through, all these different communications technologies. But like, at what point does this kind of even out? Or, like, it's like there's a big detachment between the way politics are being practiced and the way that economics are, persisting. I don't know if it...
Not sure what you mean by that.
You're talking to two political economists who've never seen those two things as separated.
They're separate.
Okay, but why? Why? Like, explain like the kind of interconnectedness of politics and economics.
All right, so let's think about this. Here's the IRA, not the Irish Republican Army, the one that Biden did that's basically a green transition bill. So he's bribing the private sector with tax credits to invest in green stuff. At the same time, he's giving the oil industry everything that they want. The reason he's doing this is basically a race of renewables against carbon assets, making a bet on carbon assets, and you'll basically get to the displacement. Below that is a political strategy. 70% of all IRA stuff is going into Republican districts. So what you're basically doing, although they'll never say this, is, hi there, American working class that have defected to the Republicans. We're called the Democrats. We used to be the party you voted for, but we basically cared about shareholder value and outsourcing, and we kind of did a lot of bad stuff as far as you're concerned. And you're pretty angry with us. What we're trying to do now is we're going to basically reindustrialize to the extent that we need to get to a greener future. And we're going to do that targeting you guys. And we're going to bring in these battery factories, and we're going to do skills, and we're going to do all this sort of stuff. Please like us again. That's what that really is, right? Now, on the other side of that, you've got the Republicans who are basically carbon-dependent industries in large extent, who see all this stuff as a mortal threat, not just electorally, but in terms of their business model. And they're like, hey, lads, here's something. They don't want you to have a Ford F-150. They want you to have a Lightning. It's an extra 20 grand. Mm-hmm. Who's going to give you that one? Mm-hmm. Oh, and also, carbon taxes, all that sort of stuff. Who do you think is going to be paying for that? All this transition stuff is a loss, and you're the ones that are going to be paying for it. You know what? They're not wrong. Look at Germany. Germany had a Green Party in power, and everyone had to get a heat pump. Great idea. Who's going to pay for that when your average German house is 200,000 euros and your heat pump's 50,000? And there's no subsidies because we need to watch the budget.
Right.
So, yeah,
and then
they're always connected.
And watch what happens to Schultz as a consequence. He's persona non grata amongst the working class.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think the political... Okay, let me try this again. And that's a great explanation. And by the way, I'm the guy that takes the sword for my audience. Looking like a fool sometimes. Okay, so when we talk about populism, we're talking about ideology. So maybe somebody at some point in the political system connects the ideology or the acceptance of an ideology to policy. But it seems like when these populist movements are taking place, the rhetoric that is being used by the political actors doesn't have to translate to policy, or it almost seems like it is just strategies for mobilizing people. And,
I see what you're getting at, right? What's the end game for these people, right? Is that really it?
Yeah, because I think the political rhetoric used to be more objective. Maybe before the big break from the church and the kind of postmodern wave, the pre-60s, pre-1960s, mm-hmm. You still had to speak to an institution. You still had to respond to an institution to be critical of the government or of public policy and so forth. Now you can make up these very extraordinarily advanced kind of rhetorical language structures, and you can create this basically this object or idea to motivate people.
Yeah, but you don't have to be that fancy about it. You can say, look, over here is the problem. The problem is basically precarious jobs, inequality, and all the money's been sucked to the top. Here's my solution. We don't like people who are not white. We should keep them out of the country. It's a standard politics of distraction. It gets you, it gets people vexed, it gets them mobilized. There's a really interesting study that Adam Tooze pointed out to a couple of weeks ago, whereby they said to people in a bunch of different countries, what of all the crises we're facing, security, economics, employment, blah, 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 right? AI, right? What's the one you care about the most? That was super fascinating. In Germany, it's immigration. Really, a third of them are obsessed by immigration. Everyone else is about 12%. It's not even registering. Even the United States, I think, doesn't get to about 20%. So, you can demonize the southern border, and it really is a real thing when you've got 10,000 people a day trying to get in your country. Yeah, you might want to check that one, right? And if you have a political party on the other side that's completely unable to talk about immigration because if you do, you're a racist, that's going to create a public policy mess. And it's not just the fault of the populists who are weaponizing this. Just as important as the things that are said are the things that can't be said.
Yes. Let me add that the basic idea of a liberal system, a liberal democratic system, not Democrat, Republican, liberal, is the notion that all people are equal. And that's a lovely idea, but it runs against our basic evolutionary preferences, which human beings are tribal. We're social animals. And so when things are getting better, you get a new snowmobile every 3 years, okay, there's immigrants, but what's that to me? That's good for them. But when you can't fix your old snowmobile because you don't have the money for it, then you're looking for something to blame. And it could be the immigrant. It's the most easy thing to blame are people that don't look like you.
Dwight Eisenhower has a great line, which was, "The hunt for a scapegoat is the easiest of all hunting expeditions."
Jeez. But it's like, why do we still have this kind of ethnocentrism and hard right politics where it becomes anti-everything that's not white? Because we know that the continent, like for example here where we're sitting, North America, it's not just been dominated by Europeans, right? There's a mix of people that live here in this space.
Right, but it turns out people from a Latino background can be like that too. Yeah. It turns out that there are black conservatives. Imagine that.
Yeah, I'm a registered Republican.
And exactly. If you talk to a registered Democrat, a Democratic activist, right? You're a registered Republican, right? There's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing wrong with you. You have a different set of preferences. Yeah. That's really all it is. So, why is it that we always scapegoat, these people? Oh, I don't know, it happens everywhere. I mean, I remember when I first came to Boston before immigration was a big thing, like a really big popular thing. It was just coming up in the politics. I saw this woman, and she was one of the most Irish-looking people I'd ever seen in my life. So QED, you were an immigrant. That had this big T-shirt on that said, "Fuck off, we're full," with a picture of the American landmass behind it. Sweet. And it just struck me the utter irony of someone who's like obviously of Irish descent in Boston, basically saying, get lost, we're full. But, why should I be surprised by that? I mean, that happens. I mean, 30% of Germans are like that all the time. Are they all wrong? Maybe from my moral point of view they are, but yeah, what do we do with that?
This leads to the last part of our conversation, which is about the decline of American influence and the decay of its institutions, right? And these are ideas, right? But I think this is the balancing act, is like we have all this political thought over however many 100 years, and these principles of liberty, equality, freedom. If it's not realistic, then why, was it basically put into the scripture, of democracy? And so maybe this, I just wanted to hear both of your thoughts. Like, why do you think there is a decline of American influence, if there is?
There are obviously disastrous policy mistakes that American leaders have made. The most obvious one, of course, is the post 9/11 case in which, 12 Saudis attack a building in New York, and we go invade Iraq and Afghanistan. The press around the world was, we are all Americans after 9/11. And what we did is show that we're just bullies.
Look, at the end of the day, more people, despite everything, more people want to live in America as immigrants than any other country in the world, right? I'm here. I'm an immigrant. I'm not going anywhere, right? Every country has its issues. Ours is no different. We're in a particularly terrible moment, but I think we'll probably survive it. It's going to be okay. It's never as bad as you think, and it's never as good as you hope. We'll just see where this one goes, right? So, barring the fact that we're all dead in the nuclear war in the next 10 years, let's separate out what you said at the start there, Chris, right? The ideals of a liberal democracy, that people should be treated equally, and this is a good way to parse liberals, conservatives, and others, right? Do you believe in equality of outcome? Because if you do, my wife grew up in East Germany. She wasn't a fan. Everyone was equal, but it kind of sucked, right? On the other hand, is it really about equality of opportunity? Yes, if we had genuine open opportunity. But then you get a problem of meritocracy. What happens if you really do have just the best and the brightest being the best and the brightest? It means that everyone else isn't the best and they aren't the brightest. And then you end up with a really ugly form of rule. So, none of this stuff is easy, but as a set of ideals, I think it's worth fighting for and preserving. As a set of practices that we've failed to achieve, it's pretty bad, but really, let's not compare murder from the Syrian Air Force to whatever the American public policy establishment is doing to its citizens. They're really different things.
Mm-hmm. It's easy to be critical of the United States, and I'd like to echo Mark's point. I have 2 passports. I choose to live here. My other country is Norway, which is, the pinnacle of the social welfare state. But it's a small country. It's resource rich, like America. It's much more egalitarian. There are many, many, many things about it. I still want to live in America. I choose to live here.
Yep.
Now,
100%.
If I were a homeless person, I may not make the same choice. But it's back to this question about America's role in the world. Perhaps it's the case that we've lost this moral leadership. Perhaps. But I don't think it's necessarily gone for good.
Yeah, I see that. And the last point I'll just add to this conversation is that I definitely think the right needs to work on this idea of ethnocentrism. I'm like 8th generation American. I don't even know where my roots leave this continent. It's probably like the mid 1700s. On the black side of my family, it's probably ties to slavery, but I know that my grandmother was born in 1898. My dad was born in 39 in Michigan. I have people that were born in Canada, New York. So I have these like very North American roots. And so it turns out there's been multiple identities on this land for a long time. And that would be just my only critique to the right, which I'm on the right also. It's probably not just about white Americans. So I have to put that out there. And the right.
Oh, but come on! It's so easy to blame them.
Yeah.
No. I mean, it's not. No, I think the movement is not just about white Americans.
No. I totally agree. Look. One of my favorite stats from the last election was that Trump increased his votes the most in non-white subgroups. Right?
Yeah,
so here's
exactly.
a guy that's supposed to be, right, the antithesis of the interests and identities of these people. And you've got lots of Latinos who are like, that's my dude, he's right, he should secure the southern border. I mean, come on. Of course it's not about that.
But I think conservatives are generally not skilled in using inclusive language because they think it's liberal and then come to find out, right? Because I grew up in a military community with multiple military bases. So there was every group, including immigrants, that were represented that bled red, white, and blue. Anyways, guys, it's been amazing to host you, and I know we've touched on
been a great chat. It's good.
Thank you.
Definitely.
It's been fascinating.
I appreciate you guys.